Inside the Hall of Fame, the air feels heavier than it should. The silence carries the weight of a century. Rows of bronze busts watch over the polished corridors, each face frozen mid-thought, eyes staring into the distance as if searching for the cheers that once surrounded them. Every name here represents triumph, endurance, legacy. Yet among these honored legends, there are ghosts that do not have a pedestal. Their stories are missing from the walls, absent from the plaques, erased from the official narrative of how football became America's obsession. I walk slowly past the familiar names that history decided to preserve: Lombardi, Unitas, Brown. But somewhere beneath the glow of the display lights, I can almost hear the footsteps of men who built this game long before the bright stadiums, before the national broadcasts, before football became a business. Men like Jim Thorpe, Fritz Pollard, Chamberlin, and Joe Guyon. Their stories exist in fragments, scattered across fading photographs and yellowed newspapers, whispered among historians who still remember what the league once tried to forget. Jim Thorpe was the first great symbol of American sport. A man whose body carried the contradictions of the nation that celebrated and punished him in equal measure. He was a Sac and Fox Native American who outperformed every expectation placed on him. In 1912, he was declared the greatest athlete in the world, only to have his Olympic medals stripped away by officials who never wanted him to stand as an equal symbol of greatness. When the National Football League was founded, Thorpe became its first president, an honor that history later reduced to a footnote. In Canton's hall, his story is there, but diluted, simplified, confined to a few paragraphs. The full truth remains buried outside these walls. Fritz Pollard's story echoes in the same silence. The first black head coach and one of the first black players in professional football, Pollard led men who often refused to stand beside him in team photographs. He played when segregation was unwritten, but absolute, when the crowd's cheers could turn to slurs before halftime. In 1921, he guided the Akron Pros to an undefeated season and the league's first championship. By the mid-1930s, the NFL quietly removed every black player from its rosters. Pollard's name disappeared with them, omitted from official programs, left out of records until decades later when researchers resurrected the facts that the league had tried to bury. Chamberlin's name deserves to echo in these halls as loudly as any coach enshrined here. He won 4 championships in the 1920s when the league was still finding its identity. He coached, played, and built strategies that would shape modern football's foundation. Yet his name is mentioned less often than the men who came after him. The ones who coached on television, whose victories were broadcast and replayed until they became gospel. Chamberlin's brilliance existed before the cameras, before the myth-making began. Then there is Joe Guyon, another Native American athlete who helped Thorpe carry the game from reservation fields to professional stadiums. He was a soldier, a player, a man whose spirit defined the toughness that football still claims to celebrate. But like Thorpe, his heritage made him expendable in a sport desperate to appear white and respectable in the eyes of its early investors. His contribution remains almost invisible, lost beneath the modern narrative of quarterbacks, dynasties, and televised rivalries. These names are not simply historical details. They are the pillars upon which the entire sport stands. Without them, there would be no Hall of Fame. Yet their recognition came slowly, if at all. Decades passed before committees bothered to revisit the dusty archives, before the selection panels began to understand that greatness existed long before television could document it. The irony is sharp. A hall built to preserve memory has been one of the greatest agents of forgetting. As I stand here, surrounded by the golden glow of celebrated history, I can feel the quiet judgment of those whose faces are missing. It is as if their spirits hover between the plaques, waiting for someone to ask the question that few dare to raise. Why were they forgotten? Why did the league they helped create choose to honor their successors, but not their names? The Hall of Fame in Canton is more than a museum. It is an archive of legitimacy. To be immortalized here is to have your contribution validated, measured, and approved by an institution that defines what football history should remember. But every archive is built on choices, and every choice creates a silence. The silence inside these walls speaks as loudly as any cheer that ever echoed through a stadium. The early decades of professional football were chaotic, unregulated, and brutally human. There were no billion-dollar contracts, no primetime schedules, no protected legends. Players worked in steel mills during the week and played on dirt fields over the weekend. They were part of a world that existed before statistics could sanctify their achievements. And because their era was less documented, it became easier for later generations to overlook them. The Hall celebrates measurable greatness, the kind that can be replayed in slow motion or written into record books. But what about the kind that existed before the camera lens, when glory was temporary and memory fragile? When the Hall first opened in 1963, its creators had to decide what counted as the official beginning of professional football. The names they selected were the ones whose careers fit neatly into the post-war narrative. The sanitized version of the game's growth. It's the pioneers who came before television, who played through racial hostility and poverty, were treated as prehistory. It was as if the game only began when it became profitable. Standing here, I think of Thorpe walking off a muddy field in 1920. Still carrying the grace of an Olympian, but none of the protection fame should have afforded him. I think of Pollard watching his players refuse to block for him, yet still finding a way to win. I think of Chamberlin, strategizing in an age when coaches doubled as players and bus drivers. And I think of Guyon, his name mispronounced, his records misfiled. His identity reduced to an afterthought in the official ledger. Every sport tells itself a story about its origins. Baseball has Cooperstown. Basketball has Springfield. But football's Hall of Fame, for all its grandeur, hides as much as it reveals. It stands on the shoulders of forgotten giants, men who bled for a game that did not yet promise them anything in return. The Hall remembers what it chooses, and in doing so, it defines what America believes about its own past. The truth is that the Hall of Fame is not only a monument to greatness, it is a reflection of power, of whose story fits the image that the league wants the world to see. The first icons of football lived in an era when being remembered was not guaranteed. Their legacy depends on those who refuse to let time erase them. This is their story. The story of how the Hall of Fame forgot football's first icons, and how, in remembering them, we begin to understand the real history of the game itself. The story of football did not begin with the Super Bowl, or even with the National Football League as we know it. Its roots stretch back to a rough, unregulated age when the game was little more than a local obsession played on dirt fields behind factories and in small-town fairgrounds. The years between the 1890s and the 1930s were not just the sport's infancy. They were its crucible. It was in those decades that the game's identity took shape, long before stadiums and sponsorships, when courage was measured not by contracts, but by endurance. If you stood on a sideline in 1905, you would have seen a different sport entirely. Players wore leather helmets that barely softened the blows. There were no hash marks, no forward pass, no standardized equipment. The violence was raw, the strategy simple, and the conditions often unforgiving. Men played not for fame, but for local pride, for the few dollars passed around in a hat after the game, or simply for the right to say they had survived. It was in this forgotten America industrial, segregated, and unpolished that football's first icons were born. Professional football existed in fragments before it became an institution. Teams like the Allegheny Athletic Association, the Latrobe Athletic Association, and the Canton Bulldogs competed long before there was a league to regulate them. They played in steel towns, mining villages, and college lots that doubled as public parks. Crowds gathered not to see celebrities, but to witness something primal, a contest of will between men whose lives mirrored the nation's restless energy. It was an era of experimentation, of constant reinvention, where every team and every player helped write a new line in the rulebook. But what set these early decades apart was not only the physical brutality. It was the social landscape that surrounded the sport. America at the turn of the century was a country divided by race, class, and opportunity. Football reflected those divisions with painful accuracy. For every small victory of inclusion, there was an equal and opposite reaction of exclusion. Black players like Fritz Pollard found temporary acceptance on integrated teams during the early years, only to be pushed out by the unspoken segregation that crept in once the sport began to attract money and attention. By the 1920s, professional football was a wild frontier of overlapping leagues and short-lived franchises. The American Professional Football Association, founded in 1920, would soon rename itself the National Football League. But even as the new title promised unity and order, the reality was chaos. Teams folded mid-season. Rules changed without warning. Coaches doubled as players, owners, and ticket sellers. The sport was growing, but it was unstable. And within that instability, many of its most influential pioneers were lost to history. The men who defined that generation rarely made headlines. Jim Thorpe, Fritz Pollard, Joe Guyon, and Guy Chamberlin were among them figures who laid the foundation for everything the modern game would become. Thorpe, a Native American whose Olympic triumphs once made him a symbol of American excellence, became the NFL's first star and its first president. Yet the league that used his fame to gain credibility would later reduce him to a ceremonial figure, quietly rewriting the story of its own creation. Pollard, a visionary strategist and athlete, broke racial barriers as the first black head coach in professional football. His leadership should have guaranteed a permanent place in the Hall of Fame. But for half a century, his name was left in the margins. Joe Guyon's legacy is even more fragile, overshadowed by his partnership with Thorpe on the Carlisle Indian team and later in the pros. He was as skilled as any of his peers, but his native heritage marked him as expendable. The records of his achievements were often incomplete, misattributed, or simply ignored. Then there was Guy Chamberlin, a man who straddled the line between player and coach, winning championships in the sport's most volatile years. He was a tactical mind ahead of his time, but because his triumphs occurred before the era of televised glory, they failed to capture the imagination of later generations. The early Hall of Fame committees faced an impossible task to define the origins of a game that had never been properly documented. But rather than seek out the whole truth, they chose a cleaner version of the past. When the Hall of Fame opened its doors in 1963, its founding curators built a narrative that began not with the game's true birth, but with its moment of national recognition. They highlighted the post-war years, when football became a unifying spectacle for a country searching for identity after global conflict. The early decades, the small-town teams, the racial integration and resegregation, the forgotten coaches were treated as prologue. In doing so, the Hall became less an archive of history and more a mirror of cultural convenience. It reflected what America wanted to remember, not what actually happened. Football was recast as a story of upward progress, of steady evolution toward perfection. But history does not evolve neatly. It fractures, collapses, and rebuilds itself from the memories of those who survived to tell it. The Hall of Fame, by its nature, is selective. Its walls are finite. Its curators must choose who belongs and who does not. Every selection is an act of remembrance and every omission is an act of erasure. The forgotten icons of early football do not fit easily into the Hall's narrative of modern heroism. Their lives were messy. Their achievements scattered across defunct franchises and abandoned records. Some played in segregated leagues, others in integrated ones. Their greatness cannot be measured by championships alone, because the system that later quantified success did not yet exist. And yet, these were the men who defined the game's essence, its grit, its resilience, its quiet defiance. Take Cal Hubbard, for example. His name is known but rarely examined in depth. He bridged two worlds, excelling as both a football player and later as a baseball umpire. He played in the early years of the Green Bay Packers and the New York Giants, shaping the physical style of play that would come to define the league. But his era was transitional, too early to receive the full glow of modern documentation, and too late to be remembered as foundational. Even when his bust found its way into the hall, it stood surrounded by the ghosts of those who never received the same recognition. The Hall of Fame presents itself as a temple of truth, yet every temple is built upon choices. The decision of who gets remembered is not only a reflection of performance, but of perception. When early football's heroes came from communities marginalized by race or class, their stories were often treated as curiosities rather than legacies. The myth of football's purity, the idea that its greatness came from unity, discipline, and American idealism required the omission of those whose experiences complicated that image. By tracing these early years, we uncover not only the sport's origins, but the cultural machinery that determined which parts of that origin were preserved. The Hall of Fame tells a story that begins in 1920, but football began long before that year. The men who played in those first decades forged the game in obscurity. They faced the brutality of early rules, the indifference of the public, and the prejudice of the institutions that eventually claimed their success. Their absence from the Hall's main narrative is not an accident, it is a reflection of how power shapes memory. This documentary does not seek to rewrite history, but to uncover what was already there. It will travel back to the muddy fields of the early leagues, to the segregated sidelines of the 1920s, to the boardrooms where decisions about legacy were made in secret. It will question the assumptions that define greatness, exploring how the Hall of Fame became both a monument to the sport's evolution and a filter that concealed its true origins. In the chapters that follow, we will trace the journey from the industrial towns that birthed professional football to the marble halls that now claim to honor it. We will hear the echoes of the first crowds, feel the weight of forgotten rivalries, and confront the uncomfortable truth that the Hall's silence is not merely historical, it is ongoing. Because to understand what the Hall of Fame forgot, we must first understand what it chose to remember. There was a time when football had no banners, no million-dollar contracts, no Super Bowls to chase. The game lived in the smoke of steel mills and the dust of rail yards. It was a raw, working man's sport, played by men who spent their days hauling coal, hammering iron, or tightening bolts on locomotives. When the weekend came, they traded the factory floor for open fields behind warehouses, where the only reward was beer money, pride, and the small thrill of hearing a local crowd cheer their name. This was football before it had a league, before it had a face, before it had a future. I have read the old box scores, the yellowed newspaper clippings that smell of rust and forgotten dreams. Names like Latrobe, Homestead, Canton, and Massillon echo from those pages. Each was a small industrial town, fierce in its loyalties and hungry for something that felt bigger than labor. The men who played were not celebrities. They were part of the same working class as the people who watched them. The line between spectator and player was paper-thin. One week, you were in the stands. The next, you were asked to put on a battered leather helmet and play guard because someone got hurt. It was chaos in the purest form. No national schedule, no contracts you could rely on, and no commissioner to dictate rules. Teams would appear and disappear overnight, depending on whether a sponsor could afford to pay for uniforms or a rail ticket. Games were arranged through telegrams and word of mouth. Payment was made in cash, often right after the final whistle. If you were lucky, you might make $25. If you were unlucky, you might lose a tooth or worse. But every man who stepped on those fields knew that pain was part of the deal. Those early teams, like the Latrobe Athletic Association and the Allegheny Athletic Club, were built on community pride. The crowds that gathered were small, but the emotions were large. They wanted to see their neighbors prove something to the next town over, to show that hard work and toughness could mean something on a muddy field. It was less about entertainment and more about survival. Football became an outlet for towns defined by exhaustion. I imagine the sound of those games. The snap of leather, the muffled grunt of collisions. The faint cheers from 100 people standing in the cold. No one imagined this sport would one day fill 100,000-seat stadiums or be broadcast into homes around the world. To them, it was a local war, a small test of pride. The players were not thinking about legacy. Hey, they were thinking about the man lined up across from them, about holding their ground in the mud. There were no helmets worth the name, just thin leather caps that offered almost no protection. Jerseys were stitched from wool, heavy when wet and impossible to keep clean. The ball itself was thick and unpredictable, more like a small watermelon than the sleek shape we know now. Passing was rare. Most plays were simple runs up the middle, collisions of force and will. And yet, this crude version of the game carried the DNA of everything that came after. In 1892, William Pudge Heffelfinger accepted $500 to play one game for the Allegheny Athletic Club. That moment, buried in a Pennsylvania newspaper, marked the birth of professionalism in football. It was not glamorous. It was not even legal under the amateur codes of the time, but it happened. One man was paid to play, and in doing so, he changed the course of the sport forever. The game was no longer a gentleman's diversion. It was a job, a risky and uncertain one, but a job nonetheless. From there, the game spread like smoke across industrial America. Railroad companies, factories, and small-town clubs began forming teams. Some would play just a handful of games a year. Others would chase challenges across state lines, traveling on borrowed trains or horse-drawn wagons. The players carried their own gear, slept in cheap inns, and often had to return to work bruised and bandaged on Monday morning. Football was not an escape from hardship. It was an extension of it. By the early 1900s, towns like Canton and Massillon in Ohio had become the epicenters of professional football. Their rivalry was fierce, almost personal. The games were brutal and often ended in controversy. There were rumors of bribes, fixed results, and illegal player signings. Even then, before the NFL existed, money and ethics were already entangled in the sports story. It was not pure. It was never pure. The players themselves were drifters of a sort. A man might play for one team one week and another the next. Loyalty was a luxury. You went where the money was, where the train ticket would take you. Some were college stars seeking a few extra dollars after graduation. Others were laborers who played for pride or the chance to earn enough to buy their families a better meal. They were the forgotten workforce that built the foundation of professional football. When you walk through the Hall of Fame today, you do not see their faces. You see the polished busts of the men who came later, when the league was established, when the cameras were rolling. But the true architects of football lived in the margins. They worked without safety nets, without fame, without certainty. They made the sport possible, then disappeared into history as if they had never been there at all. The early decades of the 20th century brought slow organization. Teams like the Akron Pros, the Dayton Triangles, and the Rock Island Independents began forming loose associations. Schedules became slightly more formal, though still chaotic. There was no governing body, no standard rulebook, and no shared vision. The sport was an evolving experiment, shaped by trial and error. Yet in that roughness lay a certain beauty. The game was unfiltered, untouched by corporate polish. I think about what those men would say if they could see the game now. The television contracts, the sponsorships, the global attention. They would probably not recognize it. To them, football was still a game of mud and pride, not spectacle and profit. But maybe they would understand something deeper. That even in its chaos, football has always been about identity. About towns defining themselves through grit. About individuals finding meaning in struggle. The history books tell us that the National Football League was officially formed in 1920 in a car showroom in Canton, Ohio. But the truth is that football was already decades old by then. The league simply gave structure to something that had already been alive and thriving in the shadows. The men who played before that meeting were not part of a system. They were the system. Their blood, their injuries, their forgotten stories built the foundation on which every future generation would stand. When we celebrate the legends of the modern game, we often forget the nameless ones who came before. The men who played in front of a few hundred people, not millions. The ones who could not afford to retire after injury. The ones who never got a plaque, a trophy, or a pension. Their era has faded, erased by the march of time and the narrowing of what we choose to remember. The Hall of Fame, for all its glory, begins its narrative at a point when football was already maturing. It does not show the bare knuckles and open fields that came before. It honors the house, but not the foundation. And that is where our story begins, in the gap between memory and myth. The question is not just who made football great, but who made it possible. Those men are gone now. Their fields are parking lots, their teams dissolved, their names carved only in forgotten newsprint. But their spirit lingers in every block, every tackle, every cheer that rises from a crowd on a cold Sunday. They may have vanished from the official history, but they are still here, in the DNA of the game itself. This was football before the league had a name. Before profit overtook pride, before records replaced stories, before the Hall of Fame began its selective remembering. It was rough, imperfect, and real. And to understand how the Hall of Fame forgot its first icons, we have to begin there, in the mud. Among the men who played for nothing but the right to be remembered, even if no one ever would. When you walk through Canton, Ohio, the bronze faces in the Hall of Fame stare back in silence. But there is one name that rises above them all, even when it is not given the prominence it deserves. Jim Thorpe. To speak his name is to invoke the origin of American football's spirit. Power, grace, humility, and tragedy, all contained within one man. He was the first president of what would become the National Football League. He was also its first global icon. Yet today, his story is treated as a footnote, polished, and softened, as if history itself decided that too much greatness from the wrong man was dangerous to remember. Jim Thorpe was born in 1887 near Prague, Oklahoma, to parents of mixed Native American and European ancestry. His lineage traced back to the Sac and Fox Nation. From the beginning, his identity was used against him. The newspapers that would later celebrate his athletic feats first described him as a curiosity, a man from the Indian schools who could run faster and leap higher than anyone they had ever seen. He grew up in a country that admired his body but not his heritage. Thorpe attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, a government-run institution designed to assimilate Native children into white American culture. Its motto was brutal in its honesty. Kill the Indian, save the man. Carlisle was meant to strip away language, identity, and culture. Yet it was there that Jim Thorpe began to rise. Under the coaching of Glenn Pop Warner, he played football, baseball, track, and anything else that tested the limits of the human body. He did not just excel, he dominated. In 1912 at the Stockholm Olympics, Thorpe entered the pentathlon and decathlon, two of the most demanding athletic competitions ever designed. He did not simply win, he crushed every opponent, often with minimal preparation and equipment that barely fit him. When King Gustav V of Sweden presented him with his medals, he said, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." Thorpe replied simply, "Thanks, King." That humility defined him as much as his power. But his triumph was short-lived. The following year, it was discovered that he had briefly played semi-professional baseball for a small wage before the Olympics. Under the strict amateurism rules of the time, that was considered a violation. The same journalists who once called him a hero now labeled him a fraud. The International Olympic Committee stripped him of his gold medals. The decision was cruel and hypocritical. Countless other athletes had taken similar payments under pseudonyms, and everyone in the sporting world knew it. The difference was that Jim Thorpe was an indigenous man, and his punishment was meant to be an example. That act of erasure followed him for the rest of his life. He turned to professional sports to survive. He played baseball for the New York Giants and later became one of the earliest stars of professional football. In 1920, when a handful of team representatives met inside Ralph Hayes' automobile showroom in Canton to form what would become the National Football League, they chose Jim Thorpe as their first president. Not because of politics or prestige, but because his name carried the weight of the sport itself. He was football's first symbol of legitimacy, proof that the game had heroes worthy of respect. Yet even as the league grew, Thorpe was never treated as an equal. His presidency was mostly ceremonial. The decisions were made by white owners and executives who saw him as a figurehead, not a leader. They used his fame to give the fledgling league credibility, then pushed him aside when the foundation was built. Within a few years, he was replaced, his role reduced to a line in the minutes of a meeting. On the field, Thorpe was unmatched. He played for teams like the Canton Bulldogs and the Owaring Indians, a novelty squad made up entirely of Native American players. The Owaring Indians were marketed as both an athletic attraction and a cultural sideshow. Before games, they were asked to perform dances or wear headdresses, as if the league wanted to remind the crowd that these men were entertainers first and athletes second. Yet Thorpe kept playing, his dignity unbroken, his presence magnetic. Accounts from those who faced him tell the same story. He could run like a sprinter, hit like a fullback, and kick like a specialist. He once punted a ball 70 yards with a single step. In one game, he scored every point for his team. He was a one-man institution. But even then, the public image of Thorpe was filtered through the lens of exoticism. Reporters described him as wild, untamed, or primitive, words that stripped his achievements of intellect and made them seem like instinct rather than mastery. When his athletic career faded, the country that once cheered him did not know what to do with him. The endorsements never came. The speaking tours dried up. He worked a series of odd jobs, including as a construction worker and even as an extra in Hollywood westerns. The same nation that had paraded him as a hero now allowed him to drift into poverty. He died in 1953, broke and largely forgotten. His body was moved from state to state as towns fought over his remains, each wanting to claim a piece of his legend. His medals were not restored until decades later, long after his death, and even then, the recognition felt incomplete. The narrative had already been rewritten. Jim Thorpe was no longer seen as the foundation of professional football, but as a distant figure. Someone to be mentioned briefly before the story moved on to safer names. The Hall of Fame, established in 1963, gave him a place, but not the prominence he deserved. His bust sits there quietly, surrounded by men whose achievements would not have been possible without his example. I have stood in front of that bust. It is smaller than I expected, almost humble. The plaque lists his accomplishments, but it does not convey the injustice that followed him. The hall calls him one of the greatest athletes of all time. Yet his real story reveals how America has often celebrated greatness only when it fits its own reflection. Thorpe's legacy challenges the myth that talent alone guarantees immortality. His erasure was not an accident. It was a decision shaped by race, class, and power. There is a pattern in how history remembers. The early decades of professional football were filled with men of color, immigrants, and working-class players. They were written out as the sport grew wealthier and whiter, their contributions replaced by a cleaner, more marketable narrative. Jim Thorpe's story is not just about lost medals or forgotten titles. It is about how systems decide whose excellence is worth preserving. Every time I hear his name, I think about the photograph of him standing alone at the 1912 Olympics. No coach, no family, no entourage. Just a man staring into history, unaware that the same world that crowned him would soon discard him. His face is calm, almost expressionless, but behind it lies everything that defines the early soul of football. Strength without arrogance, greatness without protection. When we talk about the Hall of Fame, We talk about enshrinement, about who gets to live forever. But Jim Thorpe never needed bronze to prove his worth. His life was a mirror held up to a nation still struggling to reconcile admiration with prejudice. He was the symbol of what the Hall of Fame forgot to honor: the raw, unfiltered origins of football's humanity. His medals were eventually restored, his name reinstated, but the damage was already done. Generations grew up learning a version of football's birth that barely mentioned him. The very league he helped create went on to build empires, while his descendants fought simply to protect his name from exploitation. In every sense, Jim Thorpe built the sports foundation on his back, only to have his legacy buried beneath it. To understand the Hall's silence, you have to understand the man they tried to reduce. Jim Thorpe was not a legend because of the medals he won, but because he refused to let a system erase his humanity. He played with a kind of grace that belonged to no era, a strength that transcended race, and a humility that shamed the arrogance of those who tried to control his story. He was the first great American football player, and the first to be forgotten by the system he helped create. His story sets the tone for everything that follows in this documentary. Every omission, every lost name, every quiet injustice that echoes through Canton's marble halls begins here, with a man who is too good, too proud, and too different to fit inside the story that the Hall wanted to tell. Fritz Pollard was not supposed to exist in the America that raised him. Born in 1894 in Chicago, he was one of 7 children in a working-class family that lived in a segregated neighborhood. His father was a barber, his mother a laundress. The odds were already against him. But Pollard had something that made him impossible to ignore: an unshakable will. He ran like he was trying to escape gravity itself. Every yard he gained felt like a statement to a country that told him he did not belong on the same field as white men. At Brown University, he became a phenomenon. In 1916, he led the team to the Rose Bowl, becoming the first black player to ever compete in that game. Newspapers didn't quite know how to describe him. They marveled at his speed but could not stop framing him through race. Some called him the colored whirlwind. Others compared him to animals. Yet, through all of it, Pollard played with quiet defiance. He knew what he was facing, and he met it head-on. He graduated in an era when college football was still the purest expression of the sport, and professional football was barely organized chaos. But Pollard was drawn to the challenge. In 1919, he joined the Akron Pros, small Ohio team that would become one of the original franchises of the newly formed National Football League. The next year, the Akron Pros won the first ever NFL championship, and Fritz Pollard was at the heart of it. He was a halfback, a strategist, a leader, and a spark of brilliance every time he touched the ball. His teammates respected him, though not all of them accepted him. Traveling to games was an ordeal. Pollard could not stay in the same hotels as his teammates. He could not eat in the same restaurants. When the team traveled through towns where segregation laws were enforced, he often had to sleep on the bus or in the home of a local black family. And yet, when the whistle blew, every player knew who the best man on the field was. In 1921, the Akron Pros appointed him as head coach, making him the first black head coach in professional football history. It was an extraordinary achievement and a quiet revolution. He was still a player, still taking hits, still dodging tackles, while also drawing up plays and leading his team. But his success made him a target. Other owners and coaches in the young league began to push back, quietly but effectively. The whispers began. It's not good for the image of the game. That was the start of the gentleman's agreement. There was no official document, no public announcement. Just a collective understanding among team owners that black players and coaches would no longer be signed. It began in the mid-1920s and would last until 1946. In those years, every door that had opened for Fritz Pollard was quietly shut again. Pollard saw it happening in real time. His coaching contracts vanished. Teams stopped calling. He tried to form his own squads, independent of the league's control, but they were denied recognition. By 1926, he was effectively exiled from professional football, despite being one of its brightest minds. He didn't disappear, he adapted. Pollard started his own teams, like the Chicago Blackhawks, and continued to promote the game in black communities. He believed football could be a path toward equality, a stage where talent could silence prejudice. But the NFL was no longer listening. The men who ran it had decided that integration was too risky for business. They wanted a cleaner, whiter version of the game, one that fit comfortably into the image of respectable American masculinity. The irony was cruel. The same league that would later celebrate diversity as a strength was built by men who intentionally erased it. Pollard became a ghost in his own creation. His name vanished from headlines. His accomplishments reduced to trivia. For decades, when people spoke about the early days of professional football, they spoke about the teams, the cities, the rivalries, never about the black man who had once led them. I tried to imagine what it must have felt like for Pollard to watch the league grow without him. The stands filled. The players became famous, and the money flowed, but his name remained unspoken. He lived long enough to see television bring football into living rooms across America. Yet even then, his face was nowhere to be found. In interviews late in his life, Pollard remained dignified. He spoke without bitterness, but his words carried the weight of decades of exclusion. "I knew what they thought of me," he once said. "I just didn't let it stop me." That resilience is the quiet core of his story. He didn't just fight for a place in football. He fought for the right to be remembered. The NFL's segregation was not just an absence of opportunity. It was an active rewriting of history. By the 1930s, black players were gone from the league entirely. The justification was always framed as business, that fans in certain cities weren't T-ready, or that integrated teams created logistical problems. But beneath those excuses was the simple truth that the league's owners preferred control over equality. They wanted a sport that reflected their own image of America: orderly, white, and marketable. The silence lasted 20 years. From 1926 until after World War II, the league operated without a single black player. 2 decades of potential greatness erased. Generations of athletes who might have followed in Pollard's footsteps were shut out before they ever got the chance to play. During that time, the game evolved, strategies changed, and the league built its brand. But its conscience remained hollow. It would not be until 1946, when Kenny Washington and Woody Strode signed with the Los Angeles Rams, that the NFL would reintegrate. Pollard was still alive to see it, but by then, the damage was irreversible. The history of those 20 lost years could never be fully recovered. When the Pro Football Hall of Fame was founded in 1963, Pollard's name was not among the first inductees. The league that had once used him as a symbol of progress now seemed embarrassed by his existence. It took another 2 decades for the Hall to finally recognize him. In 2005, long after his death. By then, football had become a global empire, and the story of Fritz Pollard had become almost mythic. I think about that often, how easy it is for institutions to forget. The Hall of Fame presents football as a steady, noble evolution, from humble beginnings to modern greatness. But the truth is far more complicated. It is not a straight line. It is a jagged path filled with the stories of men who were deliberately left behind. Fritz Pollard's story forces us to confront that reality. He was the first to break the color barrier and the first to feel it close behind him. He proved that leadership and brilliance were not bound by race, and the system responded by pretending he had never existed. Every time the Hall of Fame celebrates the NFL's diversity today, it does so standing on the ground Pollard paved. The image of him in his Akron uniform still haunts me. The leather helmet, the determined eyes, the unmistakable intelligence in his expression. He looks like a man who understood that his time was both groundbreaking and temporary. That is the tragedy of Fritz Pollard. Not that he was forgotten by accident, but that he was written out by design. His erasure was the first act in football's long struggle with race. It set a precedent for how the league would deal with uncomfortable truths by burying them. The Hall of Fame, for all its honor and spectacle, still reflects that silence. It honors pioneers only after time has softened the edges of their rebellion. Pollard's story belongs not just in the hall, but at its center. He represents the moment when football's promise collided with America's prejudice. His life is a reminder that progress in this game has never come easily. It has always been fought for, yard by yard, by men who refused to stay invisible. Fritz Pollard was not just a player or a coach. He was the conscience of early football, a man who believed the game could be better than the country it mirrored. And though the league forced him out, his legacy survived in the determination of those who came after. Every black coach, every player who took the field, knowing they had to be twice as good to be treated as equal, carries a piece of him. His bust now sits in Canton, finally placed among the others, though it came decades too late. It is small, understated, but powerful. The plaque tells only a fraction of the story. The rest lives in the silence between the exhibits, the silence that reminds us how easily greatness can be buried when it threatens the comfort of power. Fritz Pollard was the first to lead and the first to be erased. His fight was never truly over because it became part of the game itself. To remember him is to remember what the Hall of Fame still struggles to admit, that football's history is not a story of perfection, but of perseverance through injustice. I walk through the archives of the early game, through the brittle papers and faded ink that once documented the first sparks of professional football. It is astonishing how much has disappeared. Teams that carried the sport through its infancy, that played for little more than gate receipts and local pride, now exist only in the faint whispers of record books. The Akron Pros, the Canton Bulldogs, the Rock Island Independents, the Dayton Triangles, names that should ring with reverence but barely flicker in the collective memory of fans today. They were the league before the league, the foundation before the franchise era. The Akron Pros were the first official champions of what would later become the National Football League. Their 1920 season was rough and raw, a contest of stamina, not spectacle. They did not have television cameras, million-dollar salaries, or polished stadiums. Their field was a patch of earth bordered by wooden planks. Their jerseys unmarked by corporate logos. They played for survival and dignity. Led by Fritz Pollard and Fritz's teammate Paul Robeson on occasion. The Pros represented something rare in early 20th century America, a team that could compete on merit across racial lines. Yet even as they lifted the championship, the national papers barely took notice. The Canton Bulldogs were the giants of their day, a team built on dominance and discipline. They carried a young league on their shoulders, backed by a town that lived and breathed the game. In 1922, they went undefeated, driven by the legacy of Jim Thorpe's earlier leadership. Their rivalries with the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers shaped what the NFL would eventually become. But when the league restructured, the Bulldogs were left behind. Their records scattered, their trophies forgotten. By the time the modern NFL began keeping consistent statistics, Canton's glory had already been buried beneath the myth of founding franchises. Rock Island, Illinois, was another cradle of the sport. The Independents played on Douglas Park, a humble field surrounded by factory smoke and train tracks. They hosted some of the first organized professional games against Chicago and Decatur teams. They were the first to sign an African-American player in the 1920s, long before integration was even discussed. But when larger cities like Chicago, New York, and Green Bay became the sport's financial centers, Rock Island's name disappeared from the schedule. Their contribution was repackaged as footnotes to the legends of George Halas and Curly Lambeau. Dayton, too, has been erased. The Dayton Triangles played in the first official NFL game on October 3, 1920, against the Columbus Panhandles. That day should be carved into the Hall of Fame walls as the moment professional football began. Yet most visitors to Canton do not even know their name. The Triangles would eventually fold and be sold to investors who moved the team to Brooklyn. That same franchise would evolve into what is now the Indianapolis Colts. The Triangles' legacy was inherited by a city hundreds of miles away, their story rewritten as if it belonged to someone else. It is a quiet injustice of sports history. How easily ownership, geography, and profit can overwrite memory. The early teams did not vanish because they lacked greatness. They vanished because they lacked leverage. As the NFL consolidated into a national product, small-town teams were absorbed, merged, or erased. Their banners were torn down and their player statistics lost in transitions of bookkeeping. By the 1940s, the league that existed 2 decades earlier was unrecognizable. The NFL that America celebrates today is built upon a skeleton that few even acknowledge. I have seen old photographs of those teams. The faces look different from today's players, stern, unglamorous, practical. Their uniforms were stitched by hand. Their helmets barely more than leather caps. Behind those faces are lives that history did not preserve. Men who played by day and worked night shifts in mills or yards. Men who traveled by train to save on costs, sometimes sleeping in the stands between games. They played in snow and rain, often before crowds of a few hundred. There were no broadcast rights, no highlight reels, no endorsement deals. Yet their passion for the sport was no less fierce than that of any modern superstar. What is remarkable about those early clubs is not their records, but their resilience. They played through an era of economic depression and uncertainty, when sport was both escape and burden. The Akron Pros struggled to pay their players. The Rock Island Independents sometimes passed the hat around the stands to collect enough to finish the season. The Canton Bulldogs folded and returned multiple times, like a ghost that refused to die. The Dayton Triangles ended as a traveling team, losing more games than they won, but still carrying the title of pioneers. The Hall of Fame in Canton sits just miles from where some of those teams once played. Yet its exhibits are quiet on their full stories. Visitors see the busts of modern legends and the bright reflections of Super Bowl trophies. But rarely do they see the crude footballs that rolled across frozen Ohio fields a century ago. The league honors its beginnings selectively through the lens of what survived, not what mattered. The teams that time erased remain uninvited to their own memorial. When I study this silence, I realize it is not just historical, it is structural. The modern NFL has no use for the messy, unpolished chaos of its origins. The Akron Pros do not fit the narrative of corporate grandeur. The Canton Bulldogs cannot be marketed as a brand. The Rock Island Independents are too humble, too honest for the age of billion-dollar stadiums. So, the past is rewritten, and with each passing decade, the fog grows thicker around the truth of how the league began. And yet, I believe that the story of those first teams is not gone. It lingers in every underdog victory, every small market franchise that defies the odds. It lives in the idea that football began not as a spectacle, but as a community ritual. A gathering of people in the cold, cheering for the men who represented their towns with nothing but pride. That spirit cannot be buried by time. It survives in the quiet corners of old newspapers, in museum boxes, and in the bloodlines of players who never made it to Canton but gave everything they had. The league that time erased is more than a phrase. It is a truth about how sports remember what is profitable and forget what is pure. Before the league had a logo, a commissioner, or television rights, it had these men, these teams, and these forgotten towns. Their ghosts still stand on the sidelines of history, waiting to be recognized not as relics, but as founders. I have always believed that football's soul was born on the Sandlots. Those open dirt fields in the Midwest and Northeast were where boys became men, and where the game learned to breathe before the machines of fame and television began to control its pulse. The Sandlot was football's first cathedral. No grandstands, no cameras, just mud, cold, wind, and the echo of cleats striking the ground. But as the decades passed, those fields began to disappear. They were replaced by steel and concrete, by stadiums that symbolized a new kind of America. One where the sport belonged not to the towns that built it, but to the cities that could afford to own it. In the early days, teams like the Rock Island Independents or the Hammond Pros represented the people around them. The crowd was not an audience, it was an extension of the team. Players often worked in the same factories as the men cheering them on. After the final whistle, they would all return to the same neighborhoods, sometimes drinking together in the same corner taverns. But by the 1930s, the sport was changing. As industrialization spread and America's economy shifted toward the urban centers, football followed the money. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia began to dominate. Not because they loved the game more, but because they could sustain it financially. The league evolved from a patchwork of working-class teams to a collection of businessmen's investments. The sport's identity was rewritten in the process. The humble grit of sandlot football gave way to the polished spectacle of stadium football. Ticket prices rose. Players began to travel by train instead of by truck. Teams began to hire publicists and photographers. The game that once belonged to small-town America became a tool of big city branding. Television would finish the transformation. When the first NFL championship was broadcast in 1939, it reached only a few thousand viewers. By the 1950s, the number had exploded. Television gave football a national voice, but it also began dictating who was allowed to be remembered. The camera favored certain faces, certain teams, certain stories. Small market franchises disappeared from coverage. The NFL's narrative became filtered through the lens of what sold best on screen. It was here that the Hall of Fame's earliest selection biases took root. By the time the Hall opened in 1963, the game had already entered its television age. The voters, most of them sports writers and broadcasters, had grown up watching televised football. Their heroes were the stars of the 1940s and 1950s, the ones who appeared on the first highlight reels. The ones whose names echoed across the radio waves. But what about the men who came before the cameras? What about the players who never had their games filmed or broadcast? The bias was not deliberate cruelty. It was a consequence of visibility. Television created a hierarchy of remembrance. If you could be seen, you could be remembered. Not, your story faded into the background noise of history. The Hall of Fame, for all its reverence, was built in the shadow of that hierarchy. Its early inductees reflected the media's memory more than the game's full history. Players like Sammy Baugh, Don Hutson, and George Holizon, undeniably great men, became symbols of football's evolution. Yet, in celebrating them, the Hall left behind the nameless thousands who had carried the sport to that point. As football moved from sandlots to stadiums, the game also became a mirror of America's shifting values. It was no longer about community pride or local identity. It was about spectacle and national recognition. The sports administrators learned how to sell emotion, how to package courage and struggle into something that could be televised, sponsored, and consumed. A touchdown was no longer just a score, it was a commercial break, a moment that could be replayed, analyzed, and immortalized on film. This shift was both inevitable and tragic. The stadiums gave the sport permanence. They brought professionalism, structure, and scale. But they also stripped away something sacred, the sense that football belonged to everyone. When you watch the old Sandlot footage, you see a game without ego. There were no choreographed celebrations, no sideline reporters, no digital scoreboards. Just a whistle, a tackle, and a crowd that knew every player by name. That world is gone now, buried beneath luxury boxes and naming rights. In those early televised decades, football's story became curated. The camera focused on the heroes it could sell. Teams from large markets were broadcast nationally. Players who fit clean narratives became legends. Meanwhile, the early Trailblazers men like Fritz Pollard or Guy Chamberlin remained outside the frame. They played before the television age, and so their legacies were left to fade quietly. When the Hall of Fame began selecting inductees, it leaned heavily on contemporary fame. Sports writers of the 1960s and 1970s voted for the players they had covered, not the ones they had read about in brittle clippings from the 1910s. This is why the first generations of Hall members were overwhelmingly post-war figures. The pioneers from the Sandlot and barnstorming eras were either forgotten or added as honorary afterthoughts decades later. Even Jim Thorpe, the first great symbol of football's potential, was not inducted until the Hall's inaugural year, long after his death. Television's influence also created myths about dominance. Teams like the Packers, Cowboys, and Steelers became the faces of football, not just because of their success, but because their games were televised more often. The early powerhouses from Akron, Canton, or Rock Island never had that chance. Without moving images to preserve their glory, their stories became folklore instead of history. I sometimes wonder how differently the Hall of Fame might look if film had existed from football's beginning. Imagine if we could watch footage of the Akron pros playing in 1920, see Fritz Pollard darting through defenders, or witness Guy Chamberlin leading his men through freezing rain. Those images would have been eternal. They would have given proof to legends now told in fading ink. But instead, the record is fragmented, half memory, half myth. And when a story becomes myth, it becomes easier to control, to edit, to forget. The move from Sandlots to stadiums is not just a story of progress, it is a story of loss. The Sandlot represented honesty, imperfection, and the raw spirit of the sport. The stadium represents control, polish, and commerce. Football grew richer, but its memory grew poorer. The Hall of Fame, standing proudly in Canton, reflects that imbalance. It honors greatness, but greatness defined by visibility, not necessarily by origin. And yet, the Sandlot still whispers. Every time a child picks up a football in a park, every time a local team plays under dim lights, the spirit of those forgotten players breathes again. They remind us that before there were contracts, agents, and broadcasts, there was a simple game played by ordinary people who loved it more than life itself. From sandlots to stadiums, football traded its innocence for immortality. But the cost of that immortality was truth. The Hall of Fame may be filled with gold busts, but its silence still echoes with the voices of those who never had their moment under the lights. When the Hall of Fame opened its doors in 1963, it was presented as a monument to truth. The idea was to preserve football's story with dignity, to ensure that no name of value would ever vanish again. Canton, Ohio, was chosen as the site not only because it was the birthplace of the NFL's first meetings in 1920, but because it symbolized the small-town heart that had once defined the sport. Yet from the very beginning, the Hall was not a complete record. It was a curated one. It told the story the gatekeepers wanted told, built not from the raw soil of history, but from the polished stones of memory. The creation of the Hall of Fame began as a civic project. Canton had suffered through industrial decline, and local leaders sought something to reignite pride and tourism. The city's Chamber of Commerce proposed the idea in the late 1950s, hoping to link the NFL's growing prestige with the town's struggling economy. It was not a historian's dream. It was a marketing plan. The league approved, seeing in the proposal a way to formalize its own mythology. Football was becoming the national sport of post-war America, a symbol of toughness, teamwork, and order. A Hall of Fame would be its cathedral, the sacred ground where that image could be enshrined forever. But the question quickly became this: who decides what stories are worthy of canonization? The first selection committee was made up largely of sports writers, editors, and executives, men who had shaped football's narrative through print and broadcast for decades. Most of them had begun covering the game in the 1930s and 1940s. Long after its chaotic birth in the early 1900s, their perspective was narrow. Not because of malice, but because of proximity. They chose to honor the figures they had seen, the teams they had covered, the heroes they had personally interviewed. Those who came before, those who played in muddy fields without press boxes or television cameras, were ghosts to them. In its inaugural class of 17 inductees, the Hall of Fame included titans like George Halas, Bronco Nagurski, and Don Hutson. Their achievements were real, their greatness undeniable. Yet beneath the surface lay a pattern. Only a handful of inductees represented the pre-1930 era. Players like Jim Thorpe and Red Grange were added because they were famous symbols, easy to recognize. But for every Thorpe, there were dozens of early stars like Guy Chamberlin, Jimmy Conselman, and Paddy Driscoll who received little attention, or were added years later as historical corrections rather than founding pillars. The Hall's architecture reflected this hierarchy. Inside those first displays, the narrative of football began in the 1920s. Patch truly came alive in the 1930s and 1940s, the decades when the league stabilized. When media coverage expanded, when professional football began to look like the product that television would later amplify. Everything before that was treated as prelude, a vague, almost mythical beginning, rather than a lived reality. This institutional shaping of mythology mattered. By defining when football's real history began, the Hall effectively erased entire generations of players, coaches, and communities. The early industrial teams, the barnstorming circuits, integrated squads that existed before segregation took hold all were reduced to footnotes. The Hall did not set out to lie, simply built its truth from selective memory. The creation of Canton's Canon also coincided with America's cultural need for heroes. In the 1960s, football was becoming a metaphor for national character. It was the Cold War's sport-disciplined, strategic, physical, masculine. The NFL's leadership, led by Commissioner Pete Rozelle, understood this perfectly. They wanted the league's past to reflect values of order and progress, not chaos or controversy. The early decades of football, filled with bankrupt teams, racial integration, and inconsistent rules, did not fit that image. So the Hall of Fame presented a cleaner version of history, one that celebrated unity over conflict and polish over imperfection. This narrative control extended beyond who was inducted. It also shaped how exhibits were designed, how timelines were arranged, how stories were told. When visitors walked through those first halls, they were not just learning football history. They were being taught a national myth about progress and discipline. The photographs were carefully chosen. The language on plaques elevated certain figures to near sainthood while minimizing others. Even the order of the inductees subtly reinforced a hierarchy, the modern game standing as the pinnacle. The early years serving merely as primitive foundations. I remember standing in Canton, years later, staring at the bronze bust of Jim Thorpe. His face looked resolute, but the context around him felt incomplete. There were no signs explaining that Thorpe had been stripped of his Olympic medals for reasons rooted in class prejudice. There was no mention of how Fritz Pollard, who coached and played alongside him, had been pushed out of the league due to a silent segregation policy. The Hall celebrated greatness, but avoided the uncomfortable truths that defined it. It is easy to assume that the Hall of Fame is a neutral archive, but archives are never neutral. They are built by choices, and those choices are shaped by power. The committee members who built Canton's Canon were white men of a specific generation, influenced by the social values of their time. They viewed football through a lens of respectability, where controversy threatened sanctity. The result was a mythology that reinforced those same values, a sport that appeared cleaner, whiter, and more orderly than it truly was. Even in the decades that followed, the Hall continued to favor figures who aligned with the league's preferred image. Coaches who represented control and discipline were lionized. Players known for controversy or defiance were either softened in memory or omitted entirely. It took until 2005 for Fritz Pollard to receive proper recognition through the establishment of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, decades after his death. And it took nearly 80 years for the NFL to officially acknowledge the existence of black players who had been banned under its unofficial segregation agreement. The irony is that the Hall of Fame stands in Canton, the same city where the Akron Pros once played, where Fritz Pollard became the first black coach in professional football, and where integration briefly flourished before being erased. The hall was built atop the very ground that symbolized inclusion, yet its early narrative ignored that truth. The soil of Canton remembers what the museum's walls do not. To understand how this happened, we must recognize that the hall's founding coincided with the rise of mass media as control over sports storytelling. By 1963, football was no longer just a game. It was television's golden child. The myth of the American athlete, clean, strong, heroic, was being broadcast into living rooms every Sunday. The hall became the physical embodiment of that myth. It was not just honoring players, it was sanctifying an image of America. The story of Canton's creation is not about a conspiracy of omission. It is about the quiet, systematic narrowing of memory. History was not rewritten through lies, but through silence. And in that silence, the truth of football's first icons faded. The hall gave us legends, but legends chosen for their alignment with a narrative of progress and purity. What it did not give us were the raw, unfiltered stories of struggle, diversity, and defiance that made the game what it was. The Hall of Fame stands as both a shrine and a filter. It immortalizes greatness, but greatness as defined by those in power. In doing so, it reveals an uncomfortable truth, that history, even when carved in bronze, is never complete. By the time the 1940s rolled in, football was no longer a quaint pastime fought on frozen fields. It was a nation's pastime in waiting. But war has a way of interrupting even the most sacred rituals. When World War II engulfed the globe, the NFL, still small, still fighting for survival, was nearly swallowed by history itself. What happened in those years wasn't just about players leaving for service or teams folding. It was about memory, what was recorded, what was lost, and what was rewritten when the nation came home and needed a new myth to believe in. In 1942, the league lost a generation to uniforms of a different kind. Players who'd once worn leather helmets now wore steel. 40% of the NFL's roster enlisted. Coaches too. Even referees traded whistles for rifles. The Chicago Bears, once the monsters of the early league, saw their roster decimated. Teams merged out of necessity. The Steagles, a combination of the Steelers and the Eagles, became a symbol of wartime improvisation. It was survival, not glory. But this period also created a fracture in how football history would later be remembered. Because when the records went dark, the league's storytellers would later decide which fragments to illuminate and which to leave buried. The war didn't just reshape the rosters, it redefined the audience. In barracks and camps, soldiers listened to games on static-filled radios. Their connection to home transmitted through a flickering signal. The league learned something profound from that. Football could travel, not just across cities, but across distance, emotion, and identity. It could be broadcast, mythologized, packaged for morale. Those wartime broadcasts were more than entertainment, they were prototypes of national bonding. The same emotional rhythm television would later perfect. But while football adapted, documentation didn't. The NFL had no formal archive system. Teams folded or merged with no legal framework to preserve their history. The Boston Yanks, the Brooklyn Dodgers NFL version, and the Cleveland Rams all went through chaotic transitions. Their rosters scattered and their achievements blurred. League officials were preoccupied with survival, not preservation. And so, when post-war prosperity returned, it was the bigger cities, the New Yorks, Chicagos, and Green Bays whose legacies could be reassembled from surviving newspapers and surviving owners. The smaller market teams, the ones who'd built the foundation in the 1920s and 30s, faded like ink in the rain. Canton, ironically, was among those who nearly vanished from public record, though the Hall of Fame would eventually be built there. Canton's Bulldogs, the early dynasty of the 1920s, had already been erased from the popular timeline. The war didn't cause that directly, but it accelerated it. Because when the NFL rewrote its narrative after 1945, it wanted to present itself as modern, industrial, and unified, not fractured, not provincial. It wanted to mirror America's post-war confidence. That confidence had a sponsor: industry. Factories that had once produced tanks and munitions began producing helmets, stadium lights, and broadcast equipment. The same industrial networks that fueled wartime America were now intertwined with sport. Companies like General Electric and RCA saw football not just as leisure, but as a testing ground for post-war media dominance. Stadiums became showcases for American industry, the gleaming lights over Yankee Stadium and Wrigley Field symbolizing a nation's return to normalcy. But that industrial glow also cast shadows over the earlier, rougher era of football. The men who played before radio fame, before televised glory, were now relics in a new corporate mythology. This was also the period when professional football began consciously modeling itself on the military. The playbook, the discipline, the language of offense and defense, these weren't just metaphors anymore. Coaches like Paul Brown introduced rigorous structures inspired by wartime organization. Brown, who had served in the Navy's Great Lakes program, returned to Cleveland and rebuilt the Browns like a general reforming an army. Film study, tactical drills, positional specialization. The NFL borrowed from military efficiency and, in doing so, created an entirely new vocabulary of control, a system that valued order over improvisation, image over chaos. The forgotten years also brought forgotten men. There were players who returned from Europe and the Pacific with injuries, trauma, and no contracts waiting. Many of them had been on smaller wartime rosters or temporary merged teams. Their names didn't fit into the sleek corporate image of the new NFL. They disappeared into factories, warehouses, and small towns. Some later wrote letters to the league, seeking recognition or pensions. Most never received replies. The NFL's record-keeping from 1941 to 1945 remains among the most fragmented in professional sports. Many game films were destroyed, either recycled for silver nitrate content or lost in storage transitions. Newspapers from the period mention box scores without context. Even today, historians piecing together the full wartime record encounter contradictions: teams listed twice, rosters misappropriated, and missing statistics. It's not just incomplete, it's selective. Because when the war ended, the NFL's leadership had a choice: restore the messy pre-war continuity or start fresh. They chose the latter. The official narrative of the NFL's post-war rise begins, conveniently, around 1946, the same year the league reintegrated after a 12-year ban on black players. Kenny Washington and Woody Strode joined the Los Angeles Rams, reopening a door that had been closed since Fritz Pollard's forced exit. But the league didn't publicize it as an act of reform. They treated it as an isolated event. That subtle reframing, focusing on progress rather than atonement, became the NFL's pattern for the next half-century. The league learned how to edit its own history with cinematic precision. In that sense, World War II wasn't just a military conflict, it was a cultural reset button. The NFL emerged from it with a new identity, one that matched the industrial, suburban America it would soon dominate. The pre-war chaos, the independent clubs, the regional heroes. The small-town dynasties became incompatible with the television-ready spectacle that would soon define professional football. The forgotten years then weren't just forgotten by accident. They were buried deliberately in service of a cleaner myth. And yet, beneath that myth, the echoes remain. Every time a broadcast shows archival footage of black and white players running across muddy fields, most of those images come from these in-between years, stripped of names, stripped of context. The league that would one day trademark its own mythology built that mythology on an absence, on a silence left by war, by loss, and by the choice to move forward without looking back. What the war erased, the post-war NFL never tried to recover. Because to remember too much of what came before the instability, the exclusion, the improvisation would threaten the illusion of control it had just achieved. The war years taught the NFL a lesson it would never forget: memory, like victory, could be managed. The 1950s gave America a new religion. Television and football quickly became one of its loudest sermons. Before that decade, the game had been an event you attended, a muddy ritual witnessed in person by a few thousand. But once the cameras arrived, it transformed into something else entirely: an orchestrated performance, choreographed for living rooms, advertisers, and mythmakers. For the NFL, this was both salvation and distortion. Television didn't just show football. It rewrote it, deciding who the heroes were, who would be forgotten, and what kind of game the public would remember. In 1958, the greatest game ever played, the NFL championship between the Baltimore Colts and New York Giants, became the defining moment of the television age. The game went into sudden death overtime, the first of its kind, and an estimated 45 million Americans watched. That night, professional football crossed an invisible threshold. The players on the field were no longer just athletes. They were characters in a national story. Johnny Unitas, the Colts quarterback, became the prototype for the television age hero: stoic, clean-cut, photogenic under the stadium lights. Yet what was celebrated in that broadcast wasn't just his athleticism. It was his narrative. Television needed symbols, not historians, and in doing so, it reimagined football's past to fit its lens. The heroes of the 1920s and 1930s, the ones who played on cinder lots, or mismatched uniforms and often worked factory jobs between games, didn't fit the new image. They weren't camera-ready. The NFL, now chasing national sponsorships, quietly distanced itself from its rougher roots. Broadcasters didn't talk about the Rock Island Independence or the Dayton Triangles. They spoke of dynasties, the Packers, the Giants, the Colts, as though football's true story began when the cameras turned on. Networks like CBS and NBC saw football as an advertiser's dream. The rhythm of the game, bursts of action separated by commercial-friendly pauses, aligned perfectly with the emerging economics of television. Cigarette brands, car companies, and beer giants became unofficial core-thors of the NFL myth. Each week, millions of Americans watched as the game was transformed into a moving billboard of American masculinity. The players who fit that image, clean-shaven, disciplined, articulate in interviews, were promoted. Those who didn't were edited out, or worse, never shown at all. In this new era, the NFL's partnership with Madison Avenue shaped the league's moral architecture. Heroes weren't chosen for courage alone, but for marketability. Quarterbacks became corporate ambassadors, their leadership mythologized in both sport and sales. Running backs were described as blue-collar workhorses, while linemen became metaphors for unsung labor. Even the language of the commentators reflected Cold War values: teamwork, discipline, loyalty, sacrifice. Every touchdown became a metaphor for national identity. Every victory, a small reenactment of America's post-war dominance. But in crafting this polished image, the league committed an act of quiet erasure. Players from earlier generations, many of them black, working class, or from small forgotten franchises, were left behind in the narrative. The Hall of Fame, established in 1963, codified this erasure. Inductees were chosen largely from the television era or from figures whose names could sell tickets. Few from the early Sandlot years were honored. Fritz Pollard, the league's first black head coach and player, was not inducted until 2005, more than 8 decades after his contributions. By then, the myth of the modern NFL hero had long eclipsed the truth. The 1950s were also when the NFL began aligning its image with the emerging concept of the American dream. Players were shown buying houses, starting families, and appearing in magazine spreads. The league's publicity departments worked with life and looked to stage photographs of players with their wives and children, evidence that these men were not just athletes, but moral exemplars. It was a deliberate contrast to the rowdy image of pre-war football, when players drank, gambled, and fought in hotel bars. Television needed heroes America could trust, and so it invented them. Meanwhile, the media landscape was shifting beneath the surface. Local radio announcers, who had once been the storytellers of regional football, were replaced by national commentators with polished diction and rehearsed narratives. The league's media arm began controlling access to players, standardizing press releases, and reviewing which images would circulate. History, in effect, became curated content. The result was a football memory that looked smooth, triumphant, inevitable, as though the sport had evolved naturally into a national treasure rather than being re-engineered for the screen. The cultural impact was enormous. Children who once played pickup games on dirt fields now mimicked televised stars. They practiced the Unitas dropback, the Bart Starr cadence, the Jim Brown stiff arm. The past, the nameless men who had laid the groundwork, became invisible ghosts. When kids dreamed of the NFL, they didn't dream of the Akron Pros or the Canton Bulldogs. They dreamed of the shining stadiums they saw on Sunday afternoons, glowing through the glass of their family's black and white TV. But not everyone fit this new mythology. Jim Brown, the most dominant player of the 1960s, challenged both the league and the media narrative. He refused to play the humble, apolitical hero. His interviews were sharp, often confrontational. He spoke about race, economics, and the double standard of fame. When Brown retired at 29 to pursue film and activism, it rattled the league's image machine. The NFL wanted a symbol of strength. Brown demanded to be recognized as a man. It was a rare moment when the media's control over the football hero cracked, but only briefly. For every player who defied the narrative, there were dozens who molded themselves to it. They had to. The rise of televised sport meant that every smile, every soundbite could influence a career. Players became media-trained before they became veterans. Coaches warned them to avoid controversial topics. The league and networks had discovered something the early pioneers never faced. Image was now as important as impact. By the late 1960s, football's televised mythology had reached full bloom. The Super Bowl, born from the merger of the NFL and AFL, became an annual ritual of spectacle, a national holiday of performance. Heroes were no longer built across seasons. They were made in a single broadcast. The past faded further into myth. The black and white era, the leather helmets, the early integration struggles, all replaced by color broadcasts, halftime shows, and polished highlight reels. And so, by the time the nation entered the turbulent 1970s, the NFL's official story had been cemented. Football had always been heroic, always been unified, always been American. It was a triumph of image over memory. But beneath that image, beneath the clean lines of the broadcast, lay a century of silence, the voices of those who played before the cameras, who built the sport without ever being televised, who became invisible when the lights came on. Inside every museum, there is a quiet act of choice. Behind each polished display, there are names that someone decided not to include. As I walk through Canton and read the plaques that line the hall's walls, I realize that football's Hall of Fame is not only a monument to greatness, but also a record of omission. The process of remembering has always depended on the politics of forgetting. When the Hall began inducting members in 1963, the first committees were made up of sports writers and executives, men who lived through the early NFL years but remembered them through a haze of modern bias. They were the ones who had seen the game evolve from muddy factory fields to shining stadiums, and they believed progress meant leaving the old behind. Players from the pre-league days who had played for nickels, beer, and pride did not fit the narrative of professional excellence they wanted to promote. They wanted icons who could be marketed, not ghosts who spoke of a rougher time. Institutional amnesia is rarely an accident. It grows from habits that become policy. By the late 1960s, the Hall's selection committees were composed largely of individuals from major media markets. The new NFL, shaped by television and national advertising, wanted a clean lineage. Executives preferred heroes who reflected the American success story, not men who had faced segregation, bankruptcy, or scandal. It was easier to immortalize a quarterback who smiled for cameras than to revisit the chaos of players who rode freight trains to games. The selection process rewarded visibility. The athletes who played before the era of television had no footage to prove their brilliance. No highlight reels, no sound bites, no post-game interviews. Their legacies depended on newspaper clippings and local testimonies. Fragile evidence in a world obsessed with image. The Hall of Fame committees began to equate recognition with documentation. If there was no film, there was no case. Forgotten players could not compete with the glowing charisma of those who came after. Marketability began to define merit. The Hall of Fame grew into a symbol of the NFL's corporate strength, a brand that could sell history as a product. In this environment, men like Guy Chamberlin or Fritz Pollard were inconvenient truths. Chamberlin's teams had dominated the 1920s, winning multiple titles before the league had a national audience. Yet his story was buried under the weight of modern marketing. Pollard's legacy as the first black head coach and one of the finest tacticians of his time was reduced to a footnote, dismissed by committees that preferred simpler narratives. Inside meeting rooms, these exclusions were rationalized. Some said the records were incomplete. Others argued that early football was too different to compare with the modern game. These explanations sounded objective, but they concealed deeper motivations. The real question was not about fairness of comparison. It was about control. By shaping who counted as the foundation of professional football, the NFL could control its identity. It could erase the messy origins of a sport born from poverty and exclusion, and replace them with a polished mythology of triumph. I have read the minutes of early selection meetings. The tone is formal, but revealing. The committees often discussed how to make the Hall of Fame appealing to the modern fan, how to ensure that its inductees would draw visitors and press. The idea of fairness to forgotten pioneers was rarely mentioned. They spoke of storytelling, of presenting football as a smooth evolution rather than a fractured struggle. It was history rewritten as public relations. The omissions compounded over time. Once a player was overlooked in the first few rounds of inductions, his case weakened. Each new class of inductees pushed the old further into obscurity. By the 1970s, the Hall had enshrined a narrative that began not in the Sandlots or Steel Towns, but in the televised age of Vince Lombardi and Johnny Unitas. Those early decades became folklore rather than history. The archives were there, but no one bothered to open them. I remember speaking to a historian who spent decades studying the pre-NFL era. He told me, almost with resignation, that institutional memory is a fragile thing. Once an organization defines its heroes, it has little interest in revising the story. The Hall had created a closed circle. Fame required visibility, and visibility required fame. Players without footage or national headlines could never break through. This pattern reflected a broader truth about American sports. Recognition is never purely about achievement. It is also about timing, race, and economics. Fritz Pollard was born too early to be celebrated in the same way as Jackie Robinson. Jim Thorpe was too complex, his life too scarred by scandal and hardship to fit the image of an All-American champion. The Hall preferred legends who could be easily framed and sold. The committees also mirrored the social order of their times. For decades, there were no black members on the selection panels. Diversity of perspective was absent, and so were the stories of those who had fought for inclusion. The institutional bias was not explicit, but it was built into the structure. A few voices questioned it, but they were ignored. The machine of official memory kept running, refining its myth with each new induction. As the years passed, fans accepted the Hall's version of history as truth. Textbooks and documentaries repeated its names, while early pioneers faded from the collective mind. It was not that their achievements were erased overnight. They were simply omitted, year after year, until silence became the only record left. Institutional amnesia is a slow erasure. It does not destroy history. It buries it under repetition. The same faces appear on commemorative banners. The same stories replay every anniversary, while the real foundations of the sport remain unseen. The Hall of Fame became a mirror of the league's desire to control its own mythology. By choosing who to remember, it decided who would continue to exist. Today, when new generations visit Canton, they see an incomplete story polished to perfection. The plaques tell of glory, but not of struggle. They speak of triumph, but not of exclusion. The silence in those halls is not accidental, it is curated. Each missing name reflects a choice made long ago, a decision to value marketability over memory. The Hall of Fame stands as both a tribute and a warning. It reminds us that history, once institutionalized, becomes a form of storytelling shaped by those in power. The pioneers who built the game deserve more than a footnote in a sanitized chronicle. They deserve to be remembered not because they fit the modern image, but because they made that image possible. Their absence speaks louder than any induction speech. When I look at the bronze plaques inside the Hall of Fame, the silence between them feels almost deliberate. It is not the kind of silence that comes from absence. It is the kind that comes from exclusion. The color line, long buried beneath polished speeches and anniversary specials, never truly disappeared. It lingered like a shadow over the names that should have been honored decades earlier. In the early years of professional football, racial integration was fragile but real. Black players like Fritz Pollard and Bobby Marshall competed alongside white teammates in the 1910s and 1920s. They endured abuse from fans, isolation in hotels, and hostility from opposing teams. Yet they proved that the sport could transcend color. For a brief moment, football was ahead of its time. But the illusion did not last. By 1933, the league quietly imposed a color barrier, and black players were pushed out completely. That decision was never written into a formal rulebook. It was understood, whispered, and enforced by consensus. Owners justified it as a business necessity, claiming the country was not ready for racial integration. In truth, it was a reflection of the same segregationist logic that governed American life. The NFL wanted to present itself as respectable, clean, and marketable to white audiences. To do that, it erased the men who did not fit the image. Fritz Pollard became the most visible casualty of this unspoken divide. Once a celebrated coach and player, he found himself shut out of the league he helped build. Newspapers stopped mentioning his name. His achievements were not cited in record books. When the Hall of Fame opened in 1963, Pollard's name was not even nominated. He had been erased so thoroughly that many fans believed no black players had existed in the NFL's early years. The color line haunted the Hall of Fame's creation. The committees that selected the first inductees were composed almost entirely of white sports writers, many of whom came from an era when segregation was taken for granted. They framed football's story as one of white ingenuity and discipline, ignoring the contributions of those who had broken the first barriers. It was not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that questions began to surface about this historical silence. Even then, change came slowly. When Pollard was finally inducted in 2005, nearly half a century after the Hall's founding, the moment carried a strange weight. It was both a celebration and an indictment. By then, Pollard had been dead for more than 20 years. The speeches were polite, the tributes sincere, but there was no mistaking the lateness of the recognition. The crowd applauded, as if the overdue correction could erase the decades of neglect. But history does not forgive that easily. I have read letters from Pollard's family written to sports historians in the 1970s, pleading for his legacy to be remembered. They described his resilience, his pride, his frustration with a league that refused to acknowledge him. One line stands out. "My father did not want fame. He wanted fairness." That distinction captures the essence of the color line's ghost. It was never only about exclusion from rosters. It was about exclusion from memory. For years, the Hall of Fame avoided confronting that truth. It preferred to celebrate diversity in the present rather than accountability for the past. By inducting modern black superstars, it could project progress without revisiting the injustices that came before. The ghost of the color line remained, not as an open wound, but as an invisible boundary in the institution's own storytelling. When I walk past the busts of modern legends, I cannot help but think of the faces missing from those rows. Pollard's long-delayed induction is a symbol of the slow moral reckoning that institutions resist. It took public pressure, scholarly research, and decades of activism for his case to reach the selection committee. Even then, some members argued that the early era was too obscure, too distant to matter. They missed the point. The Hall of Fame was created to preserve legacy, not convenience. The history of racial exclusion in football is not limited to the early decades. It shaped the very language of recognition. The term pioneer was often used to soften the story, turning acts of survival into quaint anecdotes. Pollard was called a pioneer, but rarely a tactician or a strategist, though he was both. The same language that celebrated him also minimized his brilliance. That is how institutional memory sanitizes injustice, by reframing it as courage instead of confrontation. Even the timeline of reintegration tells a story of selective memory. After 1933, it took 12 years for black players to return to the NFL. When Kenny Washington and Woody Strode joined the Los Angeles Rams in 1946, the league acted as though it had rediscovered inclusion, not restored it. The pioneers of the 1920s were never mentioned. Their absence allowed the league to rewrite integration as a post-war achievement disconnected from its own segregationist past. This pattern repeated itself in the Hall of Fame. When Washington and Strode were later discussed for induction, the argument against them was always the same: short careers, limited records, small statistical sample. Yet those limitations existed precisely because they had been shut out of the system for years. The Hall measured them by the same standards it had built to exclude them. It was history judging itself through a biased lens. The color line's ghost remains visible in the slow pace of recognition. Even today, early black players are underrepresented in the Hall, compared to their white counterparts from the same era. The institution has added committees to address historical oversight. But the weight of omission cannot be lifted by paperwork. Every new induction is a reminder of how many others were denied their place for reasons that had nothing to do with ability. Racism in football was never just a matter of who could play. It was about who could be remembered. The Hall of Fame, like the league it represents, was built on narratives that reflected power. When the public wanted heroes who embodied mainstream ideals, the institution provided them. It was easier to celebrate athletic excellence than to confront moral failure. But the real history of football includes both. I think often about what the Hall could have been if it had faced the truth sooner. Imagine a ceremony in the 1960s where Fritz Pollard stood on that stage, alive, hearing the applause he had earned. Imagine him shaking hands with players he had inspired, watching a new generation finally acknowledge what he built. That moment never came. The applause arrived too late, offered to his memory instead of his presence. The color line's ghost will always haunt Canton's marble halls. It lingers in the empty spaces where busts should stand, in the archived letters that tell a different story, in the quiet knowledge that progress delayed is justice denied. The Hall of Fame was meant to honor football's greatest figures, but greatness means nothing without truth. Until every forgotten pioneer is given his rightful place, the Hall remains incomplete. A monument not only to what was achieved, but also to what was ignored. By the 1970s, football had become more than a sport. It was a product, a national ritual neatly packaged for Sunday afternoons, and the Hall of Fame became part of that packaging. What once served as a museum of grit and memory was now being transformed into a monument of marketability. As television revenue ballooned and corporate sponsors arrived, legacy itself became an asset, something to sell, to brand, and to shape for the cameras. In those early years, the Hall had tried to maintain a veneer of scholarly objectivity. The selectors were journalists, historians, and football men. But as the NFL's television partners grew more powerful, the presentation of history began to mirror the priorities of the networks that televised it. The Hall's image was tied directly to how football looked on screen: polished, heroic, patriotic. The grittier origins of the game, the small-town mill teams. The unpaid bruisers, the players of color who'd been erased, didn't fit that aesthetic. Corporate sponsorship soon dictated presentation. Companies began underwriting ceremonies, memorabilia, and even exhibit design. Each sponsorship brought money, but also subtle influence. When beer companies and automakers were footing the bill, the inductees celebrated on stage tended to be those with a cleaner image, a longer highlight reel, or enduring fan recognition. A Hall of Fame enshrined in Canton, Ohio, was now tethered to boardrooms in New York and Los Angeles. The idea of legend changed meaning. In the 1950s, legends were men who survived brutal fields and vanished with little more than scars to show for it. By the late 20th century, legends were those who could move product. A quarterback with an endorsement deal carried more cultural weight than an unsung guard who had pioneered the game's strategy decades earlier. Legacy, once an inheritance of memory, became a commodity. The architecture of Canton mirrored this transformation. The museum's exhibits shifted toward spectacle. Highlight reels, interactive screens, holograms of famous players. The stories of early teams like the Decatur Staleys or Rock Island Independents were condensed into brief plaques. Their names surrounded by neon lights and sponsor logos. The narrative had become one of entertainment history, not historical truth. Television itself played an enormous role in who was remembered. When networks like CBS and later ESPN began producing retrospectives on football's past, their source material came from available footage. And footage only existed from the post-war period onward. That meant the pre-1950s players were largely invisible to modern audiences. Their legacies faded not because they lacked greatness, but because they existed before the camera arrived. In meetings of the selection committee, phrases like fan recognition and cultural impact began to outweigh discussions of statistics or contribution. A player's legacy was increasingly measured by the number of jerseys sold or how often his highlights aired on television. The Hall of Fame voters were aware of the influence, but few could resist it. Football had become big business, and the Hall's survival depended on staying relevant to that business. Some within the Hall resisted the shift. Historians like Bob Carroll and researchers from the Professional Football Researchers Association argued for broader representation. They pushed for forgotten champions, early black players, and pre-merger stars who'd shaped the game's evolution. But their nominations often met quiet resistance. Networks wanted recognizable names. Sponsors wanted household faces. The league wanted heroes who reflected its modern image, disciplined, marketable, and safe for primetime storytelling. This filtering process extended even to the physical busts that lined the Hall's corridors. In theory, each was an equal monument to greatness. But behind the scenes, the presentation of these busts, lighting, placement, accompanying visuals was curated for visitor appeal. The stars of the television era occupied central spots, their faces illuminated. The older figures, the pioneers, were often relegated to corners or upper galleries. It wasn't an intentional slight, it was a symptom of the new logic of display. Draw attention to what sells. Football's transformation into entertainment also changed how death and memory were handled. When a Hall of Famer passed away, television tributes rolled, social media flooded with clips, and the league made official statements. Yet those whose stories had never been televised were rarely acknowledged. It was as if the Hall had quietly adopted a new rule of remembrance. You had to be seen to be remembered. The marketing of Legacy reached its peak during Super Bowl weeks, when the Hall ceremonies became televised spectacles. Induction speeches were timed for broadcast windows. Sponsor banners filled the background. The names of beer brands and automobile companies echoed in the same halls where the game's founders had once been honored with reverent silence. What few outside Canton realized was that these sponsorship deals directly influenced the hall's operations. Exhibit funding, restoration projects, and research grants were often tied to branding partnerships. When one major corporate donor pulled back, a planned historical restoration of early NFL records was quietly shelved. The league had created a self-reinforcing cycle. The past that made money was preserved. The past that didn't was quietly allowed to fade. Players from the pre-television era became footnotes. Their surviving families often wrote letters to the hall, pleading for reconsideration, providing clippings and personal archives. Some of these appeals were considered. Most were not. Without public recognition, there was no economic incentive to elevate their stories. The hall's silence was rarely cruel. It was just business. In the 1990s, as digital media began reshaping how fans consumed history, the commercialization of legacy reached new forms. Merchandising around NFL legends became a lucrative market. Trading cards, video game character packs, and documentaries celebrated a narrow pantheon, the same few names that already dominated the broadcast narrative. Forgotten players were excluded, not out of malice, but because they didn't generate clicks, ratings, or sales. By the early 2000s, legacy was a brand. Players hired PR teams to manage post-retirement image. Former stars signed memorabilia deals that positioned them within the hall's orbit long before induction. The hall, dependent on partnerships and media attention, leaned into this ecosystem. Fame and remembrance had merged into one currency. There's an irony in it all. The Hall of Fame, built to preserve memory, became a mechanism of selective forgetting. Its glowing busts and televised ceremonies projected permanence, but the stories beneath were edited for consumption. For every player immortalized in bronze, there were dozens whose names had been erased not by time, but by the market's invisible hand. The commercialization of legacy did not destroy football's soul. But it did redefine what counted as legacy in the first place. The same sport that once glorified anonymity and sacrifice now rewarded visibility and branding. The hall's marble halls and glass cases reflected that shift perfectly, a shrine not just to football as history, but to the power of presentation itself. The result is a paradox. The Hall of Fame remains one of the most sacred sites in American sports. Yet within its sanctity lies the quiet influence of marketing budgets, broadcast schedules, and corporate interests. Memory, as it turns out, can be monetized as easily as merchandise. The stories that survive are those that can be sold, and the ghosts of those who cannot. They linger, unmarketed, unremembered, waiting for someone to tell their story again. By the turn of the 21st century, football historians had begun to sense a great void in the official story. The NFL's public narrative, neat, linear, and celebratory, had left behind entire generations of players, teams, and even leagues. The accepted timeline began in 1920 with the founding of the American Professional Football Association, rebranded 2 years later as the National Football League. But to those who spent their lives in archives and basements, the truth ran deeper and older. They began to uncover the forgotten prehistory of the sport. The independent teams that played before the league had structure. And the barnstormers who traveled across the Midwest for cash prizes. Researchers like Bob Carroll, Joe Horrigan, and Ken Crippen combed through microfilm reels, newspapers, and personal letters to reconstruct the scattered fragments. They found that long before Canton's formal founding, there had been organized football rougher. Smaller in scope, but unmistakably professional. What these historians realized was that the story of American football didn't begin in one meeting room. It began in rail yards and factory towns, where workers played for local pride and cash wages. Teams like the Latrobe Athletic Association, the Duquesne Country and Athletic Club, and the Massillon Tigers were paying players years before the league claimed to exist. These were not hobbyists. They were the first professionals. Yet they remained outside the official timeline, dismissed as curiosities rather than founders. The effort to reclaim those years was more than academic. It was about justice, not only for the players themselves, but for the history of the sport. Many of these early professionals were immigrants or working-class men who never received recognition in their lifetimes. Their contributions vanished when football's official historians standardized the narrative to begin in 1920, when respectable businessmen formalized the league. That cutoff effectively erased the messy, vibrant, multicultural origins that gave the game its spirit. Descendants of those early players became unexpected advocates. Families of men like William Pudge Heffelfinger, often cited as the first paid player, began contacting the Hall of Fame to petition for acknowledgement. They sent old photographs, payroll receipts, and game programs as evidence. Some of these documents revealed that the first paid football games occurred not in Canton, but in Pittsburgh in 1892. If accepted, this would mean professional football predated the NFL's founding by nearly 3 decades. The Hall initially resisted these claims. Officially, it recognized the 1920 meeting at Ralph Hayes' Hupmobile dealership as football's birth. To alter that would require rewriting everything from exhibits to media language. Yet the pressure from researchers grew. Publications like the Coffin Corner began printing deep-dive essays that exposed how fragile the official timeline was. Academic conferences followed, where independent scholars argued for reclassification of early teams as legitimate predecessors to the NFL. Some breakthroughs finally came in the early 2000s, when digital archives made it possible to verify early records. Newspapers once thought lost were digitized, and within their pages appeared box scores, player rosters, and financial transactions that proved those early professionals were indeed paid and organized. A clearer picture emerged. Football had not suddenly professionalized in 1920. It had evolved into the league system from decades of local, independent professionalism. Recognizing this meant accepting a more complex legacy. It required admitting that the NFL's founding fathers were not the inventors of professional football, but the organizers who brought order to chaos. That distinction mattered. It shifted the narrative from a story of corporate genesis to one of cultural inheritance. The sport wasn't born in Canton. It was consolidated there. The push to reclaim the timeline also forced a re-examination of who had been excluded when the official narrative was written. For instance, women's early involvement in the sport, as team owners, promoters, and journalists, had been erased entirely. The same was true for Black and Native American athletes who played on integrated teams in the early 1900s, long before segregation became the norm. The discovery of their records redefined what the early football landscape looked like. In cities like Dayton, Akron, and Rock Island, local historical societies began collaborating with national researchers. They tracked down descendants, recovered team photos from attics, and even located missing trophies. The more they found, the more it became clear that the NFL's early chapters were a mosaic, not a straight line. Each town, each semi-pro team, contributed a piece to the sport's evolution. By the mid-2010s, the league could no longer ignore the growing historical evidence. The NFL partnered with researchers to create the Pre-NFL-Era Recognition Project, which sought to document teams active before 1920, though not yet formally absorbed into the Hall's core exhibits. These findings began appearing in publications, league websites, and social media posts. The tone was cautious. The league framed these early teams as ancestors rather than members, but it was a start. For the historians, it was validation after decades of quiet work. They had forced the sport to confront its own amnesia. Still, challenges remained. Many of the surviving records were incomplete, and disputes over team legitimacy persisted. Some teams blurred the line between amateur and professional. Others folded after a few months. Yet even amid uncertainty, one truth held steady. The game's roots were far broader and older than its official myth allowed. This reclamation movement did more than fill historical gaps. It rehumanized football's past, instead of faceless teams and forgotten statistics. It brought forward stories of men who played through injury for modest pay, of small communities whose pride hinged on Sunday games, and of immigrant leagues that blended cultures through sport. The football that emerged from these discoveries was rougher, humbler, and more honest, a people's game, not yet bound by corporate polish. Modern fans began to take notice. Documentaries appeared online, exploring the forgotten clubs of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Museums in smaller cities created local exhibits showcasing their football heritage. In Canton, the Hall of Fame began to feel pressure from both historians and fans to expand its timeline officially. To its credit, the Hall acknowledged that the story was still being written. It wasn't a full concession, but it was the first sign of openness in decades. The reclamation of the timeline also exposed how arbitrary historical beginnings can be. Every institution prefers a clean starting point, a founding moment that simplifies the past and creates a sense of control. But the truth rarely fits neatly within those boundaries. Football, like any social phenomenon, was born from hundreds of small beginnings that converged over time. The Hall's chosen date, 1920, was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Today, the work continues. Scholars, genealogists, and amateur historians collaborate across forums and archives, piecing together names that were once erased. Each discovery, a newspaper clipping, a photograph, a ledger widens the game's origin story. For every new team identified, for every early player restored to memory, the narrative becomes richer and truer. The fight to reclaim football's timeline is far from over. But it has already changed the way history is told. It reminds us that no story, no matter how institutionalized, is beyond revision. Memory belongs not to the powerful, but to those willing to search for what was lost. And in that search, football's earliest ghosts are finally being given names again. When people speak of football's strategic revolutions, they tend to begin with the modern architects Lombardi, Brown, Halas, Landry. But buried beneath those immortal names lies an entire generation of tacticians who shaped the sport before the league had broadcast rights, before playbooks were laminated, before the word franchise even existed. These were the men who built structure out of chaos, who turned backyard scrimmages into systems. Yet history has rarely spoken their names. Guy Chamberlin, for instance, was more than a player. He was the first great coach the professional game ever saw, a man whose brilliance on the sideline equaled his dominance on the field. Between 1922 and 1927, he led 4 teams to 6 league championships, a record of excellence that would still be staggering, even in the modern era. He built dynasties before the word had entered football vocabulary. His Canton Bulldogs, followed by the Cleveland Bulldogs, and then the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, set the template for sustained winning in a sport still learning how to survive. Yet Chamberlain's story is rarely told outside dedicated circles. In his lifetime, he was regarded as a quiet genius, disciplined, tactical, and loyal to his players. He preferred team balance over individual flash, a philosophy that predated the system football of the 1950s by decades. His defenses were disciplined to the point of obsession, his offenses grounded in efficiency rather than flair. But when the NFL later marketed itself through stars and spectacle, Chamberlain's methodical brilliance did not translate into headlines. He died in 1967, largely forgotten by the public whose sport he had built from the ground up. Then there was William Pudge Heffelfinger, remembered mostly for one line in the record books, the first documented professional player. Paid $500 for a single game in 1892, but that single detail reduces his legacy to a transaction. Heffelfinger was more than a novelty. He was a football pioneer in every sense. A Yale All-American who brought Ivy League sophistication to the rough industrial leagues, he served as a bridge between amateur idealism and the gritty professionalism that followed. He introduced disciplined line play, structured blocking schemes, and what early newspapers called coordinated guard movement. In an age when football was little more than organized chaos, Heffelfinger's concepts hinted at the game's strategic future. Yet by the time the Hall of Fame opened, his role had been minimized to a footnote: the first paid man, not the innovator who helped professionalize the sport structure. Paddy Driscoll, another name the Hall long sidelined, represented a different kind of innovation. A Chicago native and two-sport athlete, he brought creative versatility to football. Long before coaches drew up gadget plays, Driscoll was running halfback passes, drop-kicking from impossible angles, and serving as both quarterback and punter. In 1923, he led the Chicago Cardinals to dominance with tactics that blended instinct and discipline. Sports writers of the day called him a thinking player, a man who could read defenses in real time. His ability to adapt plays at the line predated modern audibles by decades. Yet Driscoll's reputation dimmed as the decades passed. When football entered its television era, his name faded from public consciousness. He had no surviving film reels to immortalize him, no highlight packages to replay on anniversaries. The game he helped modernize simply moved on without him. His eventual induction into the Hall of Fame in 1965 came quietly, almost as an administrative correction rather than a celebration. These men were not anomalies. The early years of football were rich with innovators whose impact was obscured by time and changing priorities. Ralph Hay, the Canton automobile dealer who hosted the meeting that formed the NFL, never made the Hall, despite being its logistical founder. Joe Guyon, Thorpe's Native American teammate and one of the era's most skilled multi-position players, revolutionized blocking technique for halfbacks, a concept that later evolved into lead blocking fundamentals. Yet his influence was often credited to white contemporaries who came after him. The reason for these omissions was not always deliberate malice, but institutional tunnel vision. When the Hall of Fame was established in the 1960s, its founding committee sought to define professional greatness through metrics that didn't exist in the sport's infancy: statistics, media exposure, and championship records tied to the modern NFL structure. Coaches and players who predated consistent record-keeping were simply harder to quantify. As a result, they became less visible and thus less remembered. But the cost of this oversight was immense. The tactical foundations of modern football, coordinated line play, positional specialization, play sequencing, were not born in the television age. They were crafted by men working with chalk, instinct, and trial. Chamberlin's disciplined approach to team construction directly influenced early strategists like Paul Brown, who studied his methods decades later. Heffelfinger's structured blocking would later resurface in the controlled schemes of the 1930s Bears. And Driscoll's improvisational offense set the philosophical stage for what would become the West Coast system generations later. What history reveals when the dust is brushed away is that innovation in football has never been confined to one era. It has simply been reframed by who was allowed to be remembered. The men of the early 1900s lacked the corporate infrastructure that preserved legacies. They worked without film, without promotion, without the narrative machinery that turned later figures into legends. Their ideas traveled forward anonymously, their names detached from their own creations. For historians, restoring these innovators to their rightful place means reconstructing the intellectual lineage of the sport. It also requires acknowledging that football's evolution has often been a process of rediscovery rather than invention. The forward pass, for instance, long credited to the 1913 Notre Dame team, had already been attempted by multiple pro squads years earlier, including teams coached by Chamberlin's peers. Many of the game's tactical cornerstones, gap blocking, delayed handoffs, defensive shifting, existed in primitive form well before official documentation began. The absence of these early minds from the Hall of Fame's upper ranks has consequences beyond symbolism. It distorts the record of football's innovation and suggests that the game's intellectual growth began only when it became commercially successful. That illusion undercuts the ingenuity of the working class and often marginalized men who built the sport from the ground up. In recent years, renewed interest in early football has led some historians to advocate for new Hall categories recognizing pre-modern strategy and coaching influence. They argue that men like Chamberlin deserve acknowledgement not only as champions, but as architects of modern football logic. Others propose that Heffelfinger's induction should be reframed to reflect his strategic impact rather than just his payment milestone. So far, the Hall has resisted structural change, but the conversation grows louder each year. To understand football's present, we must trace its intellectual DNA, and that DNA begins with men like these. The lessons they left behind, though hidden in fading box scores and scattered clippings, form the unseen backbone of every modern playbook. Every trap block, every disguised coverage, every balanced roster carries a whisper of their influence. If the Hall of Fame is meant to preserve greatness, then greatness must be measured by more than marketable eras. It must honor the thinkers who shaped the game when shaping it meant bleeding for it. It must remember those who coached by feel, strategized without film, and believed in football before it was safe to believe that it would endure. The game we know today is their inheritance, even if their names were written out of its story. By the 21st century, the silence that once surrounded football's earliest pioneers began to break. It didn't happen because of a single revelation or a new Hall of Fame exhibit. It happened because a generation of researchers, archivists, and fans refused to accept the official version of history. The NFL, long content to celebrate the post-war heroes who fit its glossy image, found itself confronted by questions that could no longer be ignored. Who really built this game? And why were so many of its founders still in the margins? The Hall of Fame in Canton began to feel that pressure most acutely. Founded in 1963 as a monument to the sport's triumphs, it had become, by the 2010s, an institution struggling to reconcile its past with a modern audience that demanded authenticity. Exhibits that once celebrated an unbroken lineage of greatness began to feel incomplete. Visitors started asking why players like Fritz Pollard, Joe Guyon, and Guy Chamberlin weren't featured more prominently. Curators could no longer rely on the phrase "the records were lost" as a sufficient answer. In response, the Hall began what it called archival re-examinations. It partnered with independent researchers and universities to digitize forgotten files, team photos, and local league documents from before 1920. The effort revealed just how fragmented the sport's early records had been. Contracts written on scrap paper, letters between coaches, and newspaper clippings hidden in family collections all helped rebuild a portrait of what football looked like before it became an empire. Yet even with these discoveries, the institution was slow to change its core narrative. The official timeline, displayed on its grand walls, still began in 1920. Some corrections came in symbolic gestures. In 2005, Fritz Pollard was finally inducted. Nearly 70 years after the NFL's gentleman's agreement forced him out. In 2018, Joe Guyon's Native American heritage was formally acknowledged in a Hall exhibit highlighting underrepresented pioneers. Small steps, but important ones. They signaled that the league, however cautiously, was beginning to confront the gaps in its story. Still, the deeper structural bias remained. The early decades were treated as prelude, not as equal chapters of football's evolution. That bias reflected how institutions shape public memory. The Hall was not designed as an investigative body. It was built to celebrate. Its architecture, its layout, its language, all was created to honor success, not to interrogate injustice. That makes historical correction a slow process. To admit that the foundation itself was incomplete means rewriting not only the plaques on the wall, but the mythology that defines the league's very identity. Younger historians, however, are less patient. They've grown up in a digital world where archives are open, data is shareable, and hidden histories are a search away. For them, the Hall's omissions are not mysteries, they're solvable problems. Platforms like the Professional Football Researchers Association, academic journals, and social media collectives have made early football history accessible in ways unimaginable a generation ago. Through crowdsourced research, forgotten teams and players are being identified. Their box scores preserved, their photographs shared. This grassroots scholarship has shifted the balance of authority. For the first time, independent researchers wield as much influence as official curators. Their discoveries reach millions online before institutions even have a chance to respond. And in that sense, history has become democratic again, not controlled by a single narrative, but alive in conversation. One of the turning points came when researchers uncovered long-lost footage of 1920s games once thought destroyed. Though grainy and incomplete, it showed the early league's athleticism and sophistication, dispelling the myth that pre-modern football was crude or primitive. These images forced a reevaluation of how advanced the sport already was, combined with newly surfaced documents proving the professionalism of teams like the Massillon Tigers and Rock Island Independents. The footage made it impossible to dismiss the era as an amateur age. The modern reckoning also involves cultural reflection. Historians and journalists now examine how race, class, and economics shaped which players became immortalized. For decades, the Hall's selection process favored stars from franchises with strong media representation teams that survived long enough to market their own legends. Meanwhile, the men who played for short-lived regional teams were forgotten, their legacies buried along with the clubs that folded during the Depression. Correcting that imbalance means more than revisiting archives. It requires rethinking what greatness means in the context of a sport built on labor and survival. In 2020, on the NFL's centennial, the league launched an initiative called Huddle for History, an outreach campaign encouraging historians and fans to submit archival materials for preservation. The program resulted in the discovery of hundreds of photographs and letters that had never been cataloged. While many praised the effort, critics argued it still fell short of true accountability. The Hall could display new artifacts, but without changing its framework, the deeper questions remained unanswered. Why were these figures forgotten in the first place? And who benefited from their absence? That tension between preservation and redefinition defines football's modern reckoning. The NFL's centennial celebrations largely emphasized continuity, celebrating the league's endurance. But the independent researchers celebrated something different: rediscovery. They focused on the cracks in the narrative, the contradictions, the forgotten faces. What they found wasn't a story of perfection, but of resilience, struggle, and human fallibility. That, they argued, was the real history worth remembering. The reckoning also extends beyond the Hall itself. Universities have begun to include early football in broader studies of American culture and race. Museums in cities like Akron, Dayton, and Rock Island host local exhibits challenging the NFL's official origin story. Public radio segments now feature descendants of early players, giving voice to families who were written out of football's genealogy. For the first time, the sport's forgotten architects are being discussed not as trivia, but as foundational figures. Inside the Hall, even the curators acknowledge a shift. Exhibits once static now include digital panels that can be updated as new research emerges. A quiet admission lies in that design choice that football history is not fixed but fluid. It changes with every discovery, every box of photographs opened in a basement somewhere, every small-town newspaper digitized for the first time. Yet the Hall's caution reflects the paradox of legacy. Institutions built to immortalize cannot easily admit their own blind spots. The Hall's mission has always been to celebrate heroes, not to question why some were never allowed to be heroes at all. But as football enters its second century, the definition of heroism is changing. It's no longer confined to championship rings and record books. It's about endurance, the ability of memory to outlast neglect. For modern fans, this reckoning is more than nostalgia. It's an act of restoration. Understanding where the game truly came from means understanding who was sacrificed for it to grow. The industrial towns, the segregated players, the silent innovators, their stories illuminate football's human cost as much as its triumph. Without them, the sports story is not just incomplete, it's dishonest. The younger historians are not asking for monuments. They're asking for truth, that the Hall of Fame reflect not only glory, but gratitude. That the busts inside Canton stand as symbols of acknowledgement, not erasure. Because history, once corrected, does more than honor the past. It reshapes how we measure greatness in the present. The Hall of Fame's walls still gleam, but the silence inside them feels different now. It no longer represents forgetting. It feels like waiting, as if the voices of the past are finally close enough to be heard again. In the quiet hours before the Hall of Fame opens, when the glass cases are still dim and the echo of footsteps has not yet filled the room, a strange peace settles over Canton. The bronze faces gleam faintly in the half-light, each one a monument to memory, pride, and myth. But as you walk deeper into the hall, the air changes. You begin to feel the weight of what is missing, the presence of those who are not here, the players who shaped this game before it had a rulebook, a salary cap, or a national audience. What defines immortality in sport? Is it the statistics, the medals, the records that endure on paper? Or is it something less tangible, the stories that survive because someone refuses to let them die? The Hall of Fame, for all its grandeur, captures only a fraction of the truth. Its polished walls cannot hold the smell of cinder dust, the sting of cold steel benches, or the roar of working men gathered around a muddy field. Those memories live elsewhere, carried in the oral traditions of families, the fragile archives of local newspapers, and the hearts of those who still care to remember. The real Hall of Fame is not a building at all. 'Tis a collective act of remembrance. It exists in every conversation about Jim Thorpe's dignity, Fritz Pollard's courage, Guy Chamberlin's genius, Joe Guyon's strength, and the hundreds of nameless athletes who played with no audience, no pension, and no promise of glory. Their greatness is not lessened by its invisibility. It is elevated by the fact that they did it without applause. Immortality in sport was never meant to be carved in metal. It was meant to be lived, felt, and carried forward. When a historian uncovers a forgotten box score from 1921, when a grandson restores an old photograph of his ancestor in a faded uniform, when a storyteller refuses to let the early leagues vanish into dust, that is where legacy truly lives. The official hall offers certainty, a curated story. But the real one offers truth, and truth is often uncomfortable. It forces us to admit that for decades, football's memory was written by those who benefited from exclusion. It makes us confront that the idea of honor in sport has always been entangled with economics, image, and power. Yet, it also shows us something redemptive, that history, once unearthed, does not stay buried. It reclaims itself through those willing to listen. When you stand before Thorpe's bust, you can almost feel the contradiction. His face is eternalized here, yet his legacy was once taken apart, piece by piece, by institutions that now celebrate him. The same could be said for Pollard, who waited nearly a century to be officially recognized. Their bronze likenesses are both tributes and apologies, testaments to what happens when truth is delayed. The hall teaches us as much about the present as the past. It reveals how the machinery of fame still operates, who gets remembered and who gets revised. It asks, quietly but insistently, what stories we will pass down when the next generation walks these halls. Will they know about the Akron pros who won the first championship and then disappeared from the official timeline? Will they know that the NFL's first commissioner once played alongside a Native American hero and a black coach? Will they know that the game's foundation was laid not by corporations, but by communities? Every sport builds its mythology. But mythology becomes dangerous when it replaces history. The Hall of Fame, for all its intentions, stands as both guardian and gatekeeper. It preserves greatness, but also defines its boundaries. To honor the game honestly, we must step outside those walls and see the full field, every player, every forgotten field, every erased name. Immortality is not a matter of being remembered by everyone. It is being remembered truthfully by someone. In that sense, the real Hall of Fame has no doors, no plaques, no marble floors. It exists wherever the story of the game is told without omission. It lives in the words of those who refuse to let the early years fade. One day, perhaps, Canton will expand its definition of greatness. Perhaps the Hall will one day reflect the messy, beautiful totality of the sport's history, the sweat and sacrifice that built it from factory lots to domed stadiums. Until then, the task falls to us, to keep the memory alive, to restore what was lost, to honor the full measure of what football once was. Because the game did not begin under lights or cameras. It began in dirt fields and frozen yards where men played for pride and the thrill of the clash. That is where the soul of the sport still lives. When you leave the hall, you pass by the final inscription. Heroes get remembered. Legends never die. But walking out into the night, you realize it is not entirely true. Legends do die unless someone keeps telling their story. And that is the real Hall of Fame. Every sport tells a story about itself, but football has always told one louder than most. It speaks in stadium lights, in halftime anthems, in the roar of millions who believe they are watching something pure and unbroken. Yet beneath that spectacle lies a quieter truth. Football's memory has never been whole. It has always chosen what to keep and what to let fade. Standing outside the Hall of Fame, you begin to feel the distance between remembrance and reality. Inside, bronze faces gleam under perfect light, the official version of greatness preserved in metal. But beyond those walls, the stories that built the foundation of the game lie scattered and forgotten. The early leagues, the industrial towns, the segregated fields. The players who never made it to Canton, not because they lacked greatness, but because their greatness was inconvenient to remember. The history of football has always been an act of selection. Committees decide what belongs. Networks decide what sells. Every decade retells the game in a new voice, polishing the rough edges, removing what no longer fits the image. Heroes become simpler, victories cleaner, and the struggles that once defined the sport reduced to footnotes. The price of forgetting is that we begin to mistake myth for truth, comfort for honesty. Football's selective memory did not begin with the Hall. It began with the first box score that left out a name. The first photo cropped to center one man instead of 11. It began with the leagues that folded without a trace, their trophies lost, their rosters unrecorded. By the time television arrived, the story was already rewritten. The NFL presented itself as a clean lineage, a single thread from small-town grit to modern empire. The real history, scattered and human, became something to manage, not preserve. What gets lost is not just information, it is identity. Every forgotten team was a community's pride. Every erased player was a life devoted to a game that offered no promise of fame. The true founders of football were not immortalized by medals or contracts. They were steelworkers, mill hands, school teachers, men who played for $10 and a meal. They played because the game gave them something larger than themselves, a moment of belonging, a shared defiance against the monotony of work and war and poverty. When we forget them, we lose more than memory. We lose the roots of why the sport mattered in the first place. The Hall of Fame celebrates excellence, but the soul of football has always lived in struggle. In the cracked helmets, the frozen mud, the games played in front of 50 people on a gray afternoon. That was where greatness began, not in victory, but in endurance. Every generation rewrites truth, often without meaning to. We honor the present, believing it to be the pinnacle, and leave behind the pieces that no longer fit the narrative. But the past does not vanish. It waits. It lingers in the background, in half-remembered names, in faded photographs. In the quiet persistence of those who refuse to let the record stay incomplete. The duty to remember is not a sentimental act. It is a moral one. Statues and ceremonies can honor, but they cannot correct. True recognition demands confrontation. It asks the modern game to look backward without flinching, to admit how many of its heroes were ignored until long after they were gone. It asks us to understand that the story of football is not a straight line of progress, but a tapestry woven from countless forgotten threads. The Hall of Fame is one version of the story. The real one is still being written. Every time someone rediscovers a name, a score, a team that history tried to erase, the duty to remember belongs to all who love this game. To fans who look beyond statistics, to writers who refuse to repeat the same narrow canon, to descendants who still carry the pride of a player whose name never reached Canton. The work of remembrance is not glamorous. It is slow, deliberate, and often thankless. But it is the only way to give justice to those who built the foundation we now celebrate. One day, when football's lights have dimmed and the modern era becomes history, others will look back on us. They will ask what kind of storytellers we were, whether we told the truth or the version that was easier to sell, whether we remembered the builders or just the beneficiaries. Our answer will not be written in plaques or busts, but in the stories we chose to tell, in the effort we made to complete the record. To remember is to resist erasure. To tell the whole story is to restore dignity. Every forgotten player, every silent team, every unacknowledged innovator deserves a place in the living memory of the sport. Not because they need our sympathy, but because the truth of football deserves accuracy. Its origins were never pure, never uniform, never singular. They were messy, diverse, contradictory, and beautiful. So, when we speak of legacy, let it mean more than trophies and fame. Let it mean the courage to look back honestly. Let it mean honoring those who had no chance to be honored in their time. Let it mean carrying forward the spirit of the game as it was meant to be raw, imperfect, human. The Hall of Fame will always stand as a monument to what was chosen. But the real monument is invisible. It lives in the stories whispered across generations. In the rediscovery of old teams like the Akron Pros, in the celebration of men like Jim Thorpe and Fritz Pollard, not as exceptions, but as foundations. The real monument is truth, and truth does not tarnish. We cannot rebuild the past, but we can refuse to let it disappear. The duty to remember belongs to anyone who has ever loved this game enough to ask where it began. It began with the nameless and the forgotten, with the pioneers who played without spotlight or certainty, with those who turned a rough pastime into a national language. That is the legacy worth defending. That is the real end of the story, not the polished bronze inside Canton, but the living memory outside its walls. The story of football does not belong to history's gatekeepers. It belongs to everyone who still believes that greatness is measured not by who is remembered, but by who deserves to be. And so, we remember.